Welcome to the Michael Brooks Show Sunday episode. We've been doing these deep historical two-part dives. Now we're going to get back into something that's a bit more contextual and current and also always rooted in history. I'm very excited, along, of course, with super producer Matt Leck, who's producing this journey, to welcome back to the show Joanna Wuest. You can go back in the archives as a patron, listen to our conversation on Beyond Intersectionality from several months ago. Really, really important conversation and a great piece in The Nation as well. Joanna is a postdoc at Princeton University and also a member of Philly DSA. And today we're going to be working around the terrain of full and complete rights for trans and queer people, how this relates to capital and labor and corporate, well, I guess in this case, what would be the color associated? We have greenwashing, we have blackwashing. What would be the color associated with LGBTQ washing in the corporate sector, Joanna?
I think it's the rest of them.
The rest, yeah, okay. Every other type of color washing.
Yeah, we're a greedy bunch.
The piece that you wrote in The Nation is the Supreme Court Capital and Queer Equality. And it, of course, refers to what was, in many respects, a positive. I mean, it was happy news, this Bostock versus Clayton County 6-3 decision penned by by Gorsuch, and of course joined by Chief Justice Roberts. Those were the two Republican swing votes on it. Can you explain this case to us and start introducing this filter? I guess first in terms of the question of full equity and civil rights flowing out of the 60s rights revolution, and then also starting to connect it to the broader dimensions implicated by labor, as an example.
Yeah, certainly. So, I'll start by saying that this was, an incredibly exciting case. It's something that I highlighted in that Nation piece, that for all the sorts of things that I think throughout our time together today, we're going to delve into the kind of complicated relationships that kind of business corporations and established Democrats and all of those, and even some Republicans and all those sorts of actors have to this case. There's some obviously, huge positives that extend from it. And part of that has to do in the fact that the cases that got consolidated under this name, Bostock v. Clayton County, dealt with Title VII of the Civil Rights Act of 1964. In particular, it has to do with an interpretation of what is sex discrimination in employment law at the federal level. And already that's something that's, a bit more centered in the long struggle for equal and civil rights in this country. It extends back to something really basic about that struggle, which was about anti-discrimination in employment. Yeah. And that's huge. We have studies that show the massive numbers of employees who are gay, lesbian, bi, trans, queer, who either have been fired or passed up for promotion because of their identities, or don't, remain closeted, at least in their workplaces and in massive parts of their lives because they previously lacked these protections. So for that reason, there's a lot to celebrate in the fact that the Supreme Court did something that Congress is totally unable to do in this moment of gridlock, which is to say, we're going to interpret this idea of sex discrimination in Title VII to apply to not just, traditionally cis women, but instead to the whole range of kind of queer identities. And the idea there is kind of the logical way that the court got to that reading of sex discrimination was to say that when we discriminate on the basis of sex, it's not because someone is a woman and placed in an inferior position because of that, or only because of that, but it's instead because we've made some sort of undue stereotyping about what it means to be properly sexed. So, if I'm a lesbian and I'm married to a woman and I'm fired for that reason, it's because on account of my sex, and the way that I'm supposed to properly engage in sort of gendered performances and roles like that. And the same with someone who is assigned male at birth, who starts to transition, and like the plaintiff in this case, Amy Stevens, said that she was going to start wearing women's attire at work in the funeral home where she worked. The idea there was that she was discriminated against because her employer said, well, you were born a man or assigned male at birth at least, and therefore you have to continue to show up to work in a particular gendered garb. So that's kind of the way, really cursory, that the court got to this, what is admittedly a huge, huge ruling, and extends civil rights protections to a massive part of the population that had previously had been denied them.
Yeah, and just to quote you briefly, you said nearly half of LGBTQ identified persons remain closeted at work, fearing the discrimination that being out might invite. And you also and now we can pivot into the labor dimension. And it's very interesting because you talk about workers at Unite Here have been organizing against apparently discriminatory practices that Starbucks has engaged in against not only LGBTQ, but also Black workers. And then you kind of open up this other range of the conversation. And again, I'll keep stressing, this is addition, not subtraction. The basis of this decision, as Joanna just outlined, is very positive. But there's a larger dimension here at work, and it involves labor. And as you can imagine, a Neil Gorsuch-led decision is not going to be pro-organized labor. And I think it's also important when we look at the main, the sort of excitement of when Republican justice swings the right way on important equity questions, like the way Justice Kennedy was a pivotal player in marriage equality, and now Gorsuch and Roberts going the right way on trans and queer equity. This does not mean any type of shift on economic, distributive, or labor lines. And that still is going to impact the full realization of the equity that is written into this ruling.
Yeah, I think it's an incredibly important thing to note, which is that while someone like Gorsuch and someone like Roberts, to a lesser extent, have shown themselves to be, allies for whatever that's worth in this particular context, they're anything but when we expand out and think about left progressive struggles, especially on the labor issue. I mean, looking, for instance, to Gorsuch, he's like his mentor, Anthony Kennedy, in a lot of ways, and in more ways than just his affinity for gay rights. But Gorsuch was placed on the court in part very enthusiastically by Trump and other conservatives because he's both ruled against labor in many respects and also has an interpretation of administrative law that, and I won't go too into the nuts and bolts of it, but just so much to say that it's an interpretation that hampers the ability of bureaucratic regulatory bodies, think something like the Environmental Protection Agency, for instance. It's an idea that those agencies should be really hamstrung, their mandate should be really narrowed, and they shouldn't be able to act in the sorts of expansive ways that you would want an administrative body like the EPA, for instance, to be regulating. So Gorsuch is put on the court by anti-regulatory conservatives and has shown time and again throughout his judicial career that that's his kind of politics. He's also very much molded in the shape of Kennedy, and that Kennedy was an opponent of labor. Kennedy was a huge part of passing both something like Citizens United, which raised the power and voice of corporations and corporate power in this country against labor. Has had devastating effects in state level fights across this country that has helped pass new right to work laws. And then Kennedy was also a kind of pivotal vote in the Janus decision before the Supreme Court a few years ago too, which essentially made the public sector right to work. So these, people on the Supreme Court are both champions of the civil rights of queer people and rights in, a really formal legal sense that's important, but still formal, while also being kind of the most insidious, villainous folks in American politics when it comes to the rights of workers. And particularly, bring up this Unite Here context, queer workers.
Yeah, so that's because we're going to get to the corporate branding of this in a few minutes, but first specifically lay out why things like at-will employment and other moves that you certainly are not going to see anti-labor justices, move to overturn, right, or support countervailing forces. Why do they, in addition to there's many implications, obviously, for everything from wages to inequality with the reversal of labor, but specifically in regards to actually substantively realizing full equity for queer people, what is the contradiction that's revealed in the Unite Here action and the way this decision was made and things like at-will employment?
Yeah, I think it's pretty simple. It's the fact that if you're subject to an at-will employment regime, like almost everyone in the United States is, especially at this low moment in the labor movement's prowess, then you can be fired for all sorts of things. Maybe most importantly, trying to stand up for your rights as a worker, like many of these Unite Here workers faced in their campaign. And so as of last, Monday? As of last Monday, the Supreme Court says, it doesn't matter if you're queer on the job, you can't be fired for that, but you can be fired for basically everything else. And we're not going to respect your rights as workers in the public sphere in particular. Like I said, in the Janus case, has been totally eroded. But you have the right to come to work as you are and as you want to be until your employer decides to cut your wages or fire you for a whole host of other things. And so, that's kind of what the promise of formal legal equality is. And it's why whenever we talk about these things, I think the move is to always also reference the fact that the civil rights movement of the 50s and 60s always linked substantive labor-based demands to these demands for formal legal equality. The 1963 March on Washington for Jobs and Freedom. One of those promises has been increasingly fulfilled, and the other is just left decimated. And so I think, we're, a half a century out from that. That's the contradiction that we're dealing with. And it just kind of gets sharper and sharper every day, it seems.
Yeah. And just actually one more delay before we get specifically to the corporate aspect of this. This reminds me, this is also a time to bring back, I think, in the beyond intersectionality piece, because what we see now is, again, that these two things are getting split off to the point where, and, whatever, on some level, like, God love him, but Mitt Romney can go out. And look, I don't want to say, I think actually legitimately in the context of the racial politics in the modern Republican Party, there is something innately healthy with a senior Republican leader saying, hey, there's some acknowledgement here of literally like the basic humanity of, in this case, 13% of the American population. That being said, not only are these modern, moves either inside mainstream liberalism in the Democratic Party, or certainly when, Republican justices rule the right way on equity, not only is just, jobs and freedom not being linked, they're being actually aggressively delinked. And the pop manifestation of intersectional politics, of course, is the, ever and ever greater obsession with, personal attitudes, personal expression, cleansing souls of every form of wrongness, and further away from what you outlined in the Beyond Intersectionality article, which was, again, really that, like, it's not only that these two things are linked, but the substantive realization of those rights has to come through these redistributive public good mechanisms.
Yeah, and I thought at the time, I'll say at the time, I got a decent amount of pushback on going against intersectionality in particular, because some critics said the issue isn't that we're fighting for all these things together, but it's the particular cynical way that it's approached. And I think the fact is that the banner of intersectionality is just increasingly used, whatever its heritage, is increasingly used by folks even like Crenshaw, who made it incredibly popular, and kind of the basis of her career, being interviewed in the New York Times saying things like, Bernie Sanders is behind these corporations who will stand up for structural racism. And if that doesn't just highlight what that term has come to be used for, and what that logic of collapsing all these things together is doing, I think you couldn't ask for a better example. And so again, it's not that we're not thinking about how to advance queer, Black workers' rights all at once in the way that some people mean when they use a term like intersectionality, but it's instead that idea is being, it's giving cover to all sorts of ways that you can, talk the talk of diversity, but not being grounded in any sort of labor or left or socialist kind of politics.
Right. And just that, that basically, And I would say, Adolph Reed, we did a great critique with him on intersectionality, and, a lot of people received it well. There was always, there's always the, you're only critiquing the bad manifestation of it. I think at a certain point, you have to ask if a theoretical framework is constantly, and, at least in the mainstream, primarily used to obfuscate a redistributive agenda for an HR agenda, then you have to question the utility of that model. And also, this was a couple of weeks before, Crenshaw suggested that, McDonald's or something is ahead of Bernie because of, of Instagram posting or something. So, it's very disturbing and very revealing. So let get to that. I'll just again quote you really briefly and then take in any direction you want. Outside of the realm of legal theory, Gorsuch and Roberts appeared to have also heeded corporate America's newfound desire for a politics of tolerance. In a slew of amicus briefs, hundreds of corporations and business associations implored the court to rule in favor of LGBTQ plus plaintiffs. What's going on here?
Yeah, so this is a story, and I think I have a lot of the pieces of it, but I'm working on essays and maybe eventually a broader book project on how we got to this moment, of how corporations decided not only to stop discriminating on these bases, but that it was going to be something that they were going to organize, sometimes autonomously, to pursue, which is just kind of this fascinating development, where you see, hundreds of corporations and business associations like the chambers of commerce and just some of the most vile corporate actors in American politics putting, these resources into fighting both at the Supreme Court, but also across different state legislatures on behalf of LGBTQ people. And they're making arguments, like I say in that piece, the briefs that they filed with the Supreme Court say things like, we're going to boost productivity, we're going to reduce administrative burdens, we're going to retain talent and cater to new clientele and all that sort of thing, by fighting for anti-discrimination law. So they have come to see anti-discrimination law and strong, robust uniform federal discrimination law as directly tied to their bottom line. And that it comes in a variety of different packages. So sometimes you have corporations who are interested in attracting a diverse customer base, and that's why they'll engage in this kind of politics. We saw this a few years ago when everyone on the internet lost their minds over that Gillette ad where the father teaches his trans son how to use a razor, which, you know, I was touched by it, but let's take a step back and see what Gillette's interest is in there. And then you also have one instance that I thought was really fascinating was this corporation called Altria Group, which is better known for making Juul vaping devices, has been being sued in courts for introducing teenagers to nicotine in ways that were starting to totally reverse the gains that we made against big tobacco and then use of tobacco in this country. And they have just poured money to shore up their reputation in these campaigns. And now you have groups like Equality Virginia, which is an LGBTQ advocacy group, writing kind of press releases for them essentially that say things like, Altria Group has shown, they say, quote, there's a clear economic and business case for fair treatment of LGBT individuals, and Altria Group is showing that. So these corporations are finding all sorts of reasons to engage in these diversity politics. And, not one of them seems to be tied to this sort of substantive equality that we started the conversation talking about.
I mean, they're right, and they're antithetical to it. I'll just mention, Cedric Johnson has a great piece called Blackwashing that just came out in Jacobin, I think today or yesterday as we're recording this. Do you think, though, that this also requires, on the left to contend with this corporate effort to honestly have, I think, a much more sophisticated understanding of capitalism? Like, we have these conversations and we say things that are definitely historically true in different contexts, like capitalism is racialized or capitalism has a gender politics to it. And it's like, yes, that's, Fordist production is built on a model, very clear kind of, gender roles, certain type of gender hierarchy, and, women are at home and are working, there's all sorts of implications economically from a system like Jim Crow, or even things just, redlining policies, which were discriminatory and racist, obviously, and also, as Toria Reid showed, had a clear economic basis. We're in a time now where some of those kind of cliche, like in a broad aggregate sense, because of the political and geographic legacies. So as an example, like we know that obviously, the women and people of color and LGBTQ people in the working class, there are these legacies that manifest in terms of extreme inequality, as well as legacies of discrimination. And at the same time, when people are using that rhetoric that might describe 1950s capitalism, that's not describing the capitalism of 2020 capitalism at all, where corporations, they might still have, and probably in most cases still do, have all sorts of good old boy networks and discriminatory policies. But on the other hand, absolutely have made the decision strategically for decades to be very serious about diversity, to be very serious in a positive sense, frankly, of capitalism, which is that you recruit the best talent wherever that might come from. I mean, that is a manifestation of a certain type of global capitalism. So as we're contending with this, does it require that people can't just rely on the same, cliches at this point about capitalism itself?
I think that's really true. I think that what we're running up against is the problem of our kind of, ideologies of resistance and what are the kinds of ways we need to situate our politics, just running into the problem that, post-Fordism has described our moment for a long time. Right. And that has had some massive effects for the way that gender and sex and sexuality, are not used to structure social reproduction in the same way that was the case, a century ago. When you did have, Family Wage running the show, and you did have, more of an imperative, capital had more of an imperative. to keep a sort of gender division of labor in the private and public spheres, keep them pretty distinct. So we are seeing that eroded, I think, and it's in part no surprise then that we're coming up at this moment. We really need to think about what are the ideologies that are used to rationalize the system's inequality, and how have they changed according to kind of the material reality that gave birth to them in the first instance. And yeah, go ahead.
No, just, I'm sorry to interrupt, but just to follow up on that, then how important do you make then in 2020 on one hand, actually Ross Douthat, I think, I mean, it's not his politics, but writing in many ways a very perceptive critique of some elements of where we're at. And then people like Eric Loomis, who've always been, again, just, I mean, look, they're just libs, that's fine. Just, whatever, just that's your politics. You don't care about, big picture substantive rights. That's not where you're at. I mean, we have a fundamental disagreement, but, okay. And there has been a real big need to try to situate the uprisings of the moment and Black Lives Matter as, not only not connected to and situated in a context that Bernie spoke about, or any number of leaders and thinkers have spoken about, but actually is like antithetical to it. And also that Crenshaw quote, right? It's not just like, oh, corporations might be allies in certain, limited things, like filing an amicus brief on the right side of a Supreme Court case, but that they are actually the vehicles of progress, at the expense of somebody who's actually trying to give everybody healthcare. I mean, that in addition to being like kind of morally demented, what does that tell us about the material realities of these new narratives that are forming right now?
Yeah, well, I'll say first off that Douthat article really, that took my breath away. And, talking to some friends, they made the excellent point that if Bernie had cinched the nomination, Douthat would probably be writing screeds against him right now and siding with
Absolutely.
the Crenshaws of the world.
Right.
And so I think that's something to keep in mind before we start to anoint anyone on the New York Times opinion editorial board.
Definitely.
As our kind of sages. But, Douthat does definitely hit on something very real and something that we're contending with, which is that convergence, that bipartisan multiculturalism, that very thin multiculturalism of the Gorsuch, of the Roberts, of the Crenshaw type, where you can kind of see your allies across the aisle as long as you're all kind of being funded by the same corporations, right?
Right.
So, who really saw this coming in a really fascinating way from the right too was former Louisiana Governor Bobby Jindal, who in 2015 wrote this screed in the New York Times in this op-ed against corporations that had started to come out in favor of same-sex marriage. And it was a dead-on arrival kind of protest. But it's really fascinating in so much as it showed the beginning of the end, I think, of that business conservative and social conservative alliance that defined the last several decades of the right in American politics. And so I think we are seeing a lot of realignment tendencies right now. And probably the one that anyone, center left to the socialist left and labor left is going to have to reckon with is that multicultural, bipartisan, neoliberal, whatever way you want to define, the types that find both political and, economic value in a thin diversity politics.
What's your sort of sketch of an answer to that?
Well, I mean, I highlighted the Unite Here Workers campaign because I thought on a very micro level, that's the kind of orientation that we're going to need to take, which is, you have to first off show everyone on the left that the working class is not a dog whistle code word for white working class. That is, that's always, at least in our lifetimes, been a rhetorical strategy of the right to pit natural allies against one another, and that sort of thing goes back all the way, to the populist era of the late 19th century, dividing the working class, dividing its inherent interest among workers by using these kind of racial ideologies. And so, that's also, we're facing a different kind of confusion, but in some ways a real parallel to that moment, and showing, demonstrating that, workers are workers and need to be united, in all of their sort of diversity, to advance struggles on behalf of their class. And so I think that's really what we need to be looking at, a labor left, for the multicultural working class, if you want to put a slogan on it.
Absolutely. I mean, the last question I have with you, and it's a slight distinction that you hear when you talk to liberals that aren't on board with this kind of agenda. And it is a difference between, I think we've been identifying a lot of people and forces, and I think Dothat, again, in all of his, look, Dothat is totally rooted in culturalist politics and of an exclusionary variety. So his analysis, he nails a lot of things, and it's something worth thinking about when a right-wing columnist is nailing certain dynamics better than ones who identify on the left. But yes, like, forget him, and in terms of his political project and sincerity, for sure. But the people he identifies and is focusing on in that article, it's really very clear. I mean, they don't have a labor redistributive agenda. That is the classic, like, these are the Adolf Reed people. There can be obscene wealth inequality. There can be massive human squalor and suffering. There can just be a generally deeply sick society. And as long as things are proportionally represented, it's fine, right? Like, we can, some of the theoretical upshots actually do go as far as, like, we can have a brutal carceral state that way over imprisons people. We just need to even out the ratios. I mean, that is one part. And that, I still think, is, that's certainly along the kind of bipartisan axis we're talking about. That's mostly what's represented there. It's certainly the leadership of the Democratic Party. Then there's people who have more of a sympathy, I think, actually, to some of these goals. And they have plenty of historical examples and plenty of polling data. It's not all wrong. Where they'll say, like, look, there is serious attitudes, like, there is racial bias. There are people who, will have a problem, kind of co-organizing with somebody who's trans. Now, I certainly think, I'll just say really quickly, I think some of that is definitely over-exaggerated in 2020. And I also think the other danger is that some of it gets conflated. Like, there's a big difference between, you can work with people and be respectful, and you might have whatever your beliefs and social practices are, which I really would hope the left could finally internalize and sort of, like, leave people alone. So stipulating those two things, I mean, what about the stronger version of that critique? That the reason, it's like, yes, the corporate class has played divide and conquer. And as an example, they've had people to play divide and conquer with. And so, that sort of argument. We should have a labor movement. We should have, universal health care. But there are these serious divisions that exist in terms of, white supremacy, anti-trans bigotry, and so on. What's the sort of answer to that kind of stronger critique versus just the people that, again, we just oppose, right?
Yeah, totally. So I'll go back to the history of the labor movement, I think, to show where my orientation is there. what my answer is, I guess. But the short of it is, if you don't think that we can do this on the left, then time to pack up and go home.
Yep.
That's just, to me, it's just defeatism. The project is to unite the working class to overthrow capital. That's the project. And it is hard at sometimes, because these ideologies, descriptive difference, really powerful and really create really horrible regimes of inequality. But those are just things that we have to contest. And so just two really quick examples from the history of the labor movement that I think flesh that out than any sort of abstract argument could ever do. As early as the 70s, you saw a really revanchist conservative right wing try to pass a law in California to ban public school teachers from teaching if they were found out to be gay. And one of the major reasons that was beaten back was because teachers in the union, the American Federation of Teachers in California, as well as the UAW, the steel workers, the Teamsters, and the culinary workers and postal employees, more important now than ever to highlight the role of the postal employees in their unions and labor struggles. All of these forces came together in that really, on the eve of Reaganism, and they came together to protect workers who were gay. And I think that's just this incredible statement on the power of uniting workers and uniting worker institutions to fight both for the rights of workers as workers, but also to be to live your life, to express your gender, your sexuality in whatever way that you wish to or feel pulled to.
That's such a great. Was there one other example you had, or?
Oh yeah, actually, this one is a little bit more toward the strategy of thinking about this, but also I love this example from the 90s where you had two instances of right-wing Republicans passing amendments to their state constitutions that would, it would not only not give you the rights that we just got from the Supreme Court, but just eliminate any sort of anti-discrimination law for queer people, the little that existed back then. And in Colorado, that passes in the 90s. And it's in large part because the labor movement is not incentivized to fight that back. They're already on their backs fighting a taxpayer Bill of Rights bill, which is just an anti-state, anti-labor piece of legislation. And there were just very little in terms of queer worker organizations that existed in Colorado at that time. But in the same time period, Oregon faces the exact same threat to queer people. But those unions were, number one, stronger, and number two, had queer caucuses within them and were fighting for sexual rights for queer people within their unions already. And so they incentivized labor to help them fight back this law. And they had been working to make their union strong and had been able to in the first place. So all of that is, again, just another example to show how important it is to find ways to buttress and bolster and strengthen the labor movement, and then to orient it towards fighting, these sort of revanchist right-wing, discriminatory regimes when they pop up.
Absolutely. It's and again, it's just, don't essentialize the United States. Don't just as there's a very correct impulse. We do a lot of foreign policy in the shows. It's like, no, like what's actually happening in Iran or China? Not to valorize these places, but to not buy the one-dimensional, warmongering, xenophobic, whatever narratives. Honestly, invite the same perspective on the United States. It's a deeply complicated country with many different living legacies. We have to choose which one.
Yeah, definitely. I think so.
Joanna Wuest, I just have enormous admiration for your work. I hope you will join us again soon. Everybody, we'll have links to follow Joanna on Twitter and the peace in the nation, the Supreme Court, capital and queer equality, and also beyond intersectionality. Joanna, thanks a lot.
Thanks so much.
Take care.